In the late summer of 2023, Caitlyn Brooks arrived in Savannah, Georgia, carrying a single suitcase and a burden heavier than she could name. Her grandmother, Allison, had passed away 6 weeks earlier, and with no remaining family in the area and the funeral already behind her, Caitlyn's only task now was to clear out and prepare the property for sale. The house, a fading Victorian perched on the corner of a quiet historic block, had belonged to Allison for over 50 years. Time had etched itself into the porch beams and window frames, and the air inside smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Every creak of the floorboards reminded Caitlyn of childhood summers, though even then the house had felt like it belonged more to memory than to the present. The interior had gone untouched for decades. The wallpaper peeled at the corners, dust gathered thick along the crown moldings, and antique furniture stood like quiet observers in every room. Caitlyn moved carefully through the spaces, sorting the practical from the sentimental, boxing up dishes, letters, and framed photographs. Each item seemed reluctant to leave its place, as if the house itself was unwilling to surrender its history. On the third day, she climbed to the attic. The wooden steps groaned beneath her feet, and the temperature shifted to a breathless stillness the moment she stepped into the space. The room was dim, lit only by the thin slats of sunlight filtering through a gable window. Covered furniture sat beneath yellowing sheets, and cardboard boxes towered in corners like forgotten altars. It was a room few people entered, a place Allison herself had referred to only rarely. Caitlyn wasn't sure what she was looking for, perhaps just closure. While sweeping aside a leaning stack of trunks, she noticed a loose panel in the wall behind an old coat rack. The edges of the wood were slightly uneven, and when she pressed against it, the board shifted. Behind it was a hollow space, just deep enough to conceal a rusted tin box. Her hands hesitated. It didn't feel like a box meant to be opened, but like one that had waited decades for this moment. The metal was cool and dust-coated. She sat cross-legged on the attic floor, her breath catching as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in yellowed linen, lay a leather-bound book. The cover was cracked with age, and the clasp barely held together. When she opened it, the scent of old ink and forgotten seasons filled the air. The first page bore a name, Grace Eddington. The entries began in June of 1934, penned in delicate cursive, almost faded to illegibility. The handwriting was steady at first, later more hurried and emotional. The journal's tone shifted with time, and so did Caitlyn's heartbeat as she read the first paragraphs. There were no obvious secrets yet, only the musings of a young girl, lonely, perceptive, hopeful. But there was something in the phrasing, in the undercurrent of withheld truths, that kept Caitlyn turning the pages. The attic was quiet, but for the sound of shifting dust and turning paper. What began as curiosity slowly evolved into fixation. This wasn't just a diary. It was a time capsule buried beneath generations, deliberately hidden away. By the time she realized the sun had disappeared beyond the horizon and the attic had grown dark and cold, she had read nearly 50 pages. The entries had begun to reveal names she didn't recognize, places that no longer existed, and feelings that refused to stay silent. The air felt heavier now, as if the house knew she had discovered something she wasn't meant to. Caitlyn closed the book gently, holding it in her lap for a long moment. She didn't yet know why Grace Eddington's words mattered, but something deep inside her whispered that her life would not be the same after reading them. Chapter 2. Grace and the Secret of Pinewood Farm. Caitlyn sat alone in the attic, her legs curled beneath her, the diary resting in her lap like a fragile relic. She turned the pages slowly, careful not to damage the thin paper, each line drawing her deeper into a story that had been buried for nearly a century. Grace Eddington's voice, delicate and unwavering, unfolded across the pages with increasing urgency. The words carried the weight of a life cornered between silence and survival. Grace had been 17 that summer of 1934, the daughter of a traveling preacher who rarely stayed in one place long enough to plant roots. Her mother had died years earlier, leaving Grace to navigate the world with little more than faith and observation. When her father accepted a temporary posting near Macon, Georgia, Grace had taken a seasonal position at Pinewood Farm, home to the Dalton family. The estate sprawled across rolling fields of cotton and oak-lined driveways, with servants' quarters tucked discreetly out of sight. The Daltons were a family of wealth, tradition, and unspoken power. Their influence stretched through every corridor of local politics and commerce. Grace described the house in vivid detail: the coldness of its halls, the sterile grandeur of its parlor, the whispering hush of its dining room. But her attention always returned to one figure: William Dalton, the only son, newly returned from college and expected to inherit the empire. He was older, reserved, and carried himself with the kind of careless confidence born of entitlement. At first, he barely acknowledged her, but as the summer deepened, their paths crossed more often. A book exchanged in the orchard, a glance held too long across the barnyard, a note left tucked beneath a windowsill. What began as fleeting gestures grew into long conversations and shared silences that brimmed with unspoken tension. In the diary, Grace never used the word love, but her descriptions of William were filled with conflict, desire tangled with fear, joy laced with dread. Their meetings became secretive, always under cover of night or behind closed stables. She wrote of his gentleness, his uncertainty, and the way he whispered that he would find a way to make them belong together. But Grace had lived enough life to know how stories like hers ended. By late August, she knew she was pregnant. The moment of realization was written with shaking lines, the ink darker, heavier. She had not told William, unsure whether to trust him or protect him. She had not told her father, who would have disowned her without hesitation. She had no one, and so she kept it secret, hiding her body beneath loose garments, excusing her illness with summer heat. The fear of discovery seeped into every sentence, growing with each passing day. Eventually, the secret was uncovered. Grace didn't detail how, only that one morning she was summoned to the main house and never returned to the servant quarters. The pages that followed grew fragmented, the handwriting more frantic. She was taken from the farm under cover of night, driven to an unknown location by two men she didn't recognize. They spoke in clipped tones, refused to answer her questions, and left her in the care of a stern woman in a white apron who told her to stop asking why. She gave birth in early February of the following year, in a cold room without windows. The entry for that day was brief. A girl, perfect. They won't let me hold her. After that, there was silence, several pages torn out, as if Grace had changed her mind about what she could afford to remember. The diary resumed weeks later, her tone hollow. The baby, she wrote, had been adopted by a wealthy couple from Charleston, George and Marianne Brooks. The arrangement had been orchestrated by the Daltons themselves, who paid handsomely to ensure discretion. Grace was told she could never contact the child, never claim her, and never return to Pinewood. The Daltons, she wrote, believed they had erased the mistake, but Grace had preserved the one thing they couldn't control: her story. She ended the final entry of that chapter with a promise that one day someone would read these words and know the truth. Her daughter's name was Clara. Caitlyn closed the diary slowly, her hands trembling. Clara Brooks had been her grandmother, the woman who raised her mother, the woman who had never known where she came from. And now Caitlyn did. Chapter 3. The Unbearable Truth of the Surname. Caitlyn spent the next morning in a daze, the words from Grace's diary echoing through her mind like a distant melody she couldn't turn off. The revelations were too specific to dismiss as fiction, too personal to be coincidence. She had slept little, her thoughts circling the same relentless conclusion. If Grace had given birth to a daughter in secret, and that daughter had been adopted by George and Marianne Brooks, then Clara, her grandmother, had never been who everyone believed her to be. And neither had Caitlyn. With trembling hands and a growing sense of dread, Caitlyn took the next step. Verification. She began with public records, digging through digitized birth certificates from Charleston, 1935. It took hours of slow, methodical searching, navigating through countless blurred documents and mismatched filings. But eventually, she found it. Clara Brooks, born February 3, 1935. Female, adopted. The certificate listed George and Marianne Brooks as the legal parents. The line for birth mother read M. Eddington, written in faint type, nearly obscured by an official stamp. No first name, no father. Caitlyn stared at the screen in silence. The initials matched. The date matched. But it wasn't just a match of logistics. It felt like an intimate confirmation whispered from the past. That missing name, that deliberate omission, was not an error. It was intentional. A redaction by design. The gravity of it settled in slowly. Clara had never known her real mother. She had been raised believing she was chosen by loving parents, but never told the true circumstances of her origin. Her identity had been rewritten before she could speak, her story curated by people with more influence and more to protect. Caitlyn's hands hovered over the keyboard as the weight of her family history began to realign itself in her mind. She wasn't just a descendant of immigrants and Charleston merchants. She was the great-granddaughter of a teenage servant girl and the heir to one of Savannah's most powerful bloodlines. Downstairs, in the study cluttered with inherited files and boxes of forgotten letters, Caitlyn returned to the search for anything that could tie the pieces together. In a box labeled Clara, Personal, she found it, a sealed envelope, aged and brittle at the edges, bearing no stamp or date. It was addressed in faint handwriting, "To my daughter, if you ever find this." Inside was a single page, folded carefully, written in Clara's unmistakable script. Caitlyn unfolded it with reverence. The letter was soft and sorrowful, full of restrained longing. Clara wrote that she had always felt there was something unfinished in her story, something no one would tell her. She admitted to finding a photograph once, hidden in Marianne's vanity, of a girl who looked like her, but was dressed in servant's clothing. When she asked about it, Marianne had claimed it was a distant cousin. Clara never believed it. She spoke of a recurring dream of standing in a field of cotton, the sun too hot, the wind heavy with silence. She had no memories of that place, but something in her bones told her it had existed. She closed the letter with a line Caitlyn would never forget. "If there was ever a truth I wasn't meant to know, let it still live through you." Caitlyn sat back, the letter trembling in her hands. Everything aligned. The diary, the birth records, and now this silent testament, written in her grandmother's own voice. The story was no longer just an echo from a buried attic, or a series of inked memories from a girl long dead. It was part of her blood, part of the fabric of her family. The Daltons hadn't simply arranged an adoption. They had erased a child from their legacy and replaced her with silence. Caitlyn's name, her history, her place in the world, none of it was what she had believed. She now understood that the Dalton family had not only hidden a scandal. They had taken everything from Grace, her daughter, her name, her future. And in doing so, they had robbed Clara of the right to know where she came from and robbed Caitlyn of the stories that should have been passed down through generations. The truth was no longer a whisper in a journal. It had become a reckoning. Chapter 4. The Gala and the Fall of a Name. Caitlyn no longer hesitated. The truth she had uncovered could not remain hidden. It pressed on her chest like a weight, demanding release, and she knew that silence would only allow history to repeat itself. The Dalton family still thrived in Savannah, their name emblazoned on plaques, museum wings, and public gardens. They hosted charity drives, sat on city councils, and sponsored preservation projects through their Historical Heritage Foundation. To most, they represented Southern legacy and dignity. But Caitlyn now knew the story they had buried beneath that polished facade. The annual Dalton Heritage Gala was held at the Mercier Carpenter House, a former plantation-turned-museum, meticulously restored with Dalton funds. The event drew Savannah's elite: politicians, donors, academics, and descendants of old Southern families who viewed heritage as currency. Caitlyn purchased a ticket under the guise of a freelance journalist working on a story about generational philanthropy. Her credentials were never questioned. A media badge opened doors that would otherwise be guarded, and her quiet confidence disarmed any suspicion. The night of the gala arrived under a velvet sky. Caitlyn dressed with precision, choosing a navy silk dress that carried authority without drawing attention. The hall sparkled with chandeliers and gilded mirrors, while a string quartet played soft versions of Southern ballads. Waiters in crisp uniforms passed trays of champagne and oysters, and laughter rose gently above the hum of conversation. She moved through the crowd with practiced ease, stopping to admire exhibits about Georgia's cotton history, pausing at portraits of Dalton patriarchs. On one wall, a large oil painting depicted William Dalton in his prime, standing beside an oak tree with a hunting rifle. His gaze was calm, confident, unbothered. Caitlyn stared at the painting for a long time. In her purse, she carried a printed excerpt from Grace's diary and the letter Clara had written. In her other hand, she clutched a folder marked only with the initials G.E. Charles Dalton, grandson of William and current head of the Dalton Foundation, stood near the central staircase speaking to a group of board members. He was in his late 50s, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed, with the easy authority of someone who had never been publicly challenged. Caitlyn waited until the crowd around him thinned before approaching. She introduced herself briefly as a journalist covering historical narratives of Southern families. He greeted her politely, used to reporters and small talk. In one swift, measured motion, Caitlyn handed him the folder. She said little, only that it contained documents he needed to see privately. He accepted it without looking inside, likely assuming it was a routine press inquiry. But the weight in her gaze lingered, and for a moment, Charles looked back at her with a flicker of something less certain. She turned and walked away before he could ask anything more. That night, Caitlyn didn't sleep. She sat by the window of her rented apartment, the city lights of Savannah flickering below like distant fires. The next morning, the storm began. The Sunday edition of the Savannah Chronicle landed on front porches across the city before sunrise. The headline stretched across the fold in bold serif letters, "The Child of Cotton Silence." The article bore no byline. It cited anonymous historical records, excerpts from a diary of a servant girl named Grace Eddington, and a personal letter written by a woman adopted in 1935 under suspicious circumstances. It traced the line from Grace to Clara to Caitlyn, drawing a direct and damning connection to the Dalton family's legacy. The piece did not accuse with rage, but revealed with precision. It detailed how the Daltons had concealed the birth of an illegitimate child, arranged an anonymous adoption, and systematically erased any trace of Grace from their official history. The article questioned the authenticity of the Dalton Foundation's narrative, its claims to preservation, and its silence about the laborers and women whose stories were excluded from the curated past. By noon, the story had gone viral. Local news outlets picked it up first, followed by national platforms with headlines like "Southern Dynasty Faces," "Truth About Hidden Heir." Comment sections exploded. Historians weighed in. Advocacy groups called for transparency and a full audit of the Dalton Foundation archives. Protesters appeared outside the museum within 24 hours, holding signs that read, "Preserve truth, not just facades." Within days, Charles Dalton released a public statement calling the matter a deeply personal family issue and promising an internal review of Foundation records. But the damage was done. Donors withdrew. University partnerships paused. The Dalton name, once untouchable, now sat under the microscope of public scrutiny. Caitlyn watched it unfold not with triumph, but with steady resolve. She had not wanted destruction, only honesty. But the truth had never been gentle. It peeled away illusions with sharp edges. The child once silenced by cotton fields had been heard. And now, the house that erased her was beginning to crumble. Chapter 5. The New Testament. Weeks passed in uneasy silence following the publication of the story. The Dalton name continued to reverberate in the headlines, and their once revered foundation became a symbol of reckoning rather than preservation. Then, without ceremony or warning, Caitlyn received a formal letter on Dalton Foundation stationery. It was signed by Charles Dalton. The letter was brief but significant. Charles acknowledged the authenticity of Grace Eddington's diary and Clara Brooks' letter. He wrote that the Dalton family had reviewed private writings left by William Dalton, handwritten journals stored in the family's restricted library. In those pages, William had admitted to the affair with a young servant in the summer of 1934. He had expressed guilt, remorse, and a deep regret for remaining silent. But he had never attempted to find or reclaim the daughter that was taken from him. He had died carrying a truth he had not dared to speak aloud. Caitlyn read the letter multiple times. It did not absolve anyone, but it opened a door. A quiet acknowledgement that history had been distorted, and that someone in power was finally willing to look at it without turning away. Days later, her phone rang. It was a representative from the Dalton family's legal counsel. They requested a private meeting to discuss terms. The meeting was held in a neutral office space, far from the museum halls and plantation walls that once displayed the Dalton legacy with pride. Caitlyn entered with a calm that belied the storm within her. She made her expectations clear from the beginning. She did not want financial restitution. She did not want apologies wrapped in PR strategy. What she wanted was justice, visible, lasting, undeniable. After weeks of negotiation, a compromise was reached. The Dalton family agreed to donate a portion of their ancestral landholdings on the outskirts of Savannah, land once cultivated by laborers whose stories had never been told. That land would be used to create a nonprofit crisis center for women facing unplanned pregnancies, designed to offer counseling, medical care, and safe housing. The building would feature a memorial hall named in honor of Grace Eddington. Her portrait would hang near the entrance, alongside a plaque that told her full story, not as a servant girl, but as a mother, a writer, and the silenced branch of a Southern legacy. The Dalton Foundation also agreed to commission an independent historian to revise their public archives, correcting omissions and restoring the erased lineage. For the first time in generations, Clara Brooks' birth record would reflect her true origin, and Grace's name would be restored to the family's official genealogy. There would be no more anonymous initials or blank lines where a life had once been buried. Caitlyn declined the monetary settlement offered to her directly. She asked instead that those funds be used to digitize and preserve the testimonies of women from similar stories, those whose lives had been hidden beneath layers of shame, silence, or social control. Her grandmother's name would become a starting point for others to reclaim their own. When the agreements were signed, there was no ceremony, no cameras, just a notary's quiet voice, the scratch of pens on paper, and a profound stillness that settled like dust over a long-sealed room now finally open. Later that week, Caitlyn visited the land where the center would be built. It was quiet, overgrown in places, with scattered oaks and wild magnolias reclaiming their place. The earth felt ancient, but not lifeless. She stood there as the wind moved through the trees, and for the first time, she felt something close to peace. The past could not be changed, but its echoes could be given shape, its ghosts, a voice, and its victims, a name. Chapter 6. The Staircase Without an Attic. 1 year later, the house that had once stood in quiet decay at the edge of Savannah's historic district no longer bore the weight of silence. Caitlyn had spent months overseeing the restoration of her grandmother's home, not to erase its age, but to honor its memory. The wood had been sanded but left imperfect, the wallpaper replaced with archival images, and the attic, once hidden beneath dust and grief, was no longer sealed. The space had been transformed into a modest exhibit, a tribute not to wealth or lineage, but to truth reclaimed. Visitors now walked through the rooms, not as tourists, but as witnesses. Displayed in glass cases were the handwritten pages of Grace Eddington's diary, carefully preserved and arranged alongside letters, photographs, and newspaper clippings. One wall held a timeline tracing the lives of three women, Grace, Clara, and Caitlyn, connected across generations by loss, silence, and a quiet, unrelenting strength. In a corner, a listening booth played recordings of volunteers reading passages from the diary aloud, their voices weaving Grace's story back into the fabric of the community she had once served in shadows. School children arrived in small groups with notebooks and questions. Local historians brought flowers and notes. Survivors of similar stories left letters in a basket at the door, many unsigned. The exhibit did not seek pity, nor did it provoke outrage. It offered reflection, a space to consider what it meant to hide a life and what it meant to uncover one with care. Caitlyn moved through the rooms often, not as a curator, but as a steward. She straightened frames, refilled pamphlets, spoke softly with guests. Each time someone lingered at Grace's final entry or stared too long at the portrait of Clara as a young woman, Caitlyn felt the presence of the past, not as a weight, but as a hand on her shoulder. On a warm April afternoon, Charles Dalton entered the house quietly. He wore no suit, no pin, no mask of formality. He moved with the tentative steps of someone uncertain whether they had a right to be there. Caitlyn saw him from the far end of the hallway and approached without hesitation. He extended his hand, and she shook it without performance. Their conversation was brief, contained in glances and nods. Whatever words passed between them remained private, but they held the quiet dignity of recognition. He did not come to defend the family name. He came to see what truth looked like when it no longer hid. By evening, the last visitors drifted out, and the gallery grew still again. Caitlyn climbed the stairs one last time, not to revisit the attic as it had been, but to close it for the night. The wooden steps no longer creaked beneath her. They had been reinforced during renovation, made stable, safe, no longer secret. The attic was no longer a place of hiding, but a room filled with light and the quiet breath of memory. She stood by the window, where once she had read the diary in silence, and looked out over the trees. The Dalton house still stood across town, grand, unchanged in architecture, but its windows no longer shimmered with untouchable authority. Its history now shared the city with another story, one that had waited beneath floorboards and behind paper for nearly a century. Caitlyn descended the staircase, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind her. The truth had been spoken. The attic had done its work. The house no longer needed a ladder to its hidden corners. The story had come down to meet the world.